So this is going to be my last ride on the Triumph Scrambler 1200. Now there are two categories of reasons I've got rid of it, one of which is because it doesn't suit me and it might not suit you as well for the same reasons, and the other are a number of problems I've had. So I'm going to hop on it now and tell you the reasons that it doesn't suit me, and then we'll go on to the faults and that sort of stuff afterwards. Stick around for that because there are some fairly major ones. So let's start off with the reasons that I don't think it's suitable for me anymore. And you might find that these reasons don't fit your criteria as well. And these aren't things that I picked up on the test ride. So first up is the power. Now, it only has 89 horsepower, which on paper you can of course look at and say, well, that's not a lot of go. And it is not actually, it really isn't. It's I find it's a bit lagging, and I really think that on a bike this heavy, something like 120 horsepower is probably a bare minimum. Now I came from a Ducati Monster 1200 that had maybe 140, 150 horsepower and weighed probably 20 kilos less. So it was always going to be a big step down, but I thought I'd be okay with it. And the reason for that is when I went on a test ride, for a start I knew, well, you know it's going to be a sacrifice. But when I took it out on a test ride, it felt pretty decent. Alright, it's got 80 odd foot-pounds of torque, which is a lot. And you really feel that if you're not doing over 60-70 miles an hour, which basically, unless you really rag it, is what you do on a test ride. I only did probably 70 max on a test ride. If you're doing those kind of speeds, this thing has got a ton of grunt. Just for ripping around, it's great. It's the low down torque and mid-range torque is sweet. And even then, so I'm just ripping it in fourth gear, in the wrong gear for acceleration, and it feels good. It's a fast low down bike, but it just runs out of breath really kind of 6,000 revs onwards. Certainly past 7,000 it doesn't go. And for me, that's just when things are starting to get a bit interesting. And on a bike with more juice, that's when you start to wet yourself with excitement, in a good way, of course. And also, it's for overtaking. So I find that I don't overtake on this as much as I would do, because if you're overtaking at 70 miles an hour and you need to give it the beans, you're going to run out of juice pretty quickly. And I found myself in some tight enough squeezes, not properly tight in terms of danger of a collision, but tight enough to make me go, oh, that's a bit nasty. Whereas if you've got a bit more juice, you don't ever have that worry. And I don't like the worry of knowing whether or not I can overtake, because it means I then end up not overtaking. So it feels obvious to say that it's not got much power, but when you test ride it, it feels good because it's got so much low down and mid-range. And also I would say that is where I spend almost all of my time. So actually, if you're happy with that, power is not going to be a problem. It does feel grunty and pushy. It's just, for me, I feel like I need a bit more juice. The second reason is wind protection. Now at this point you're going to be laughing at me saying I bought a naked 90 horsepower adventure bike and now I'm complaining about wind protection and power. Well, yeah, I know, it's a little bit daft, but I've decided that actually the wind protection on this isn't very good. And there were a couple of reviews I read actually that said, it can do everything. It can do motorway touring and all the other stuff as well. And actually I don't agree. Any bike can do motorway touring. It's possible to do it, but it's just really not ideal for me on this bike, because you just don't have the wind protection. So I have the touring screen on this. You can get larger screens by Jivy, but they look a little bit daft when you get much bigger. And the touring screen on this, it takes a little bit of wind off your chest, and it makes the difference between the bike being comfortable at 70 miles an hour and the bike being just about bearable at 80 miles an hour on the motorway. But really it doesn't do an awful lot, and it certainly doesn't do enough. And I find that if I'm sitting on the motorway, I don't really want to go much faster than 70 for any length of time, because you get blasted. 80 miles an hour I'll sit at if I have to, but I don't really feel comfortable doing it, to be honest. And if you're for me, if I'm riding at that speed on a motorway for long enough, I get really tired and I get off the bike and I practically have to go and have a nap, which is arguably because I'm an old man, but I am only, 38 years old, so I'm not that old, but still. For me, I just find the wind protection is inadequate, and again, it's a bit of a daft comment to make of a naked bike, because you know what you're getting with that, but it's just, my requirements have changed now, I think, and that's not enough for me. So that's the second thing that I'm finding a problem with. Let's do some revs, shall we? Right. So, the third and final thing then. One of the main reasons I bought this bike was because my missus really likes the Bonneville styling. And I like the Bonneville styling, but I wanted something with a bit of leg room, and that's what I went for with this. So, to be fair, the leg room is extremely generous. The suspension soaks up anything. You can go over sleeping policemen as long as you stand up like this, which, by the way, is really cool and good fun. And the suspension soaks up everything. It's great. Leg room is fantastic. However, for pillions, personally, I don't think this is a very good bike, and that's for my situation certainly, because I weigh, well, between me and my missus, let's not out my missus inadvertently, between me and my missus, I reckon we probably weigh around 26 stone, alright? And when you've got that much weight on the bike, it doesn't really like it. It sags massively, and even, to be fair, when I tried to put the kickstand down when I've got a pillion on, I can't do it at a slight angle. The bike has to be bolt upright, otherwise it won't, and even maybe a little bit leaning to the right hand side, otherwise the kickstand it'll get stuck on the tarmac and it doesn't come up. And that's how much it sags, and it just feels really crap when you're riding with a pillion. It really does sag at the back and make everything much worse. Now that is partly because you're putting a lot of extra weight on the back of a motorbike, and that's going to happen with everything, but that can be solved, and that can be solved by adjusting the suspension. Now the suspension on this is Öhlins bling bling fully adjustable stuff with fancy little piggyback shocks, and I will admit the looks is one of the main reasons I went for this bike. So it's got fully adjustable suspension, which on paper sounds fantastic, but the reality is adjusting the preload is not easy. Do you know what, I've looked it up before and I can't remember exactly how you do it, but I think you have to turn the rear shock, spin the rear shock round, as in screw it round. It's a bit of an odd setup, and it's just a massive hassle. It's not easy to do. What you really want is either electric suspension where you can press a button, tunnel, electric suspension where you can press a button, or a little remote preload adjuster that's sticking out the side by your exhaust, so you just turn it a couple of clicks to the right when you've got a pillion, and then turn it a couple of clicks to the left when you don't have a pillion. So that is really the problem with this bike in terms of pillion. You can adjust the preload suspension, but for an idiot like me who doesn't know his spanner from his elbow, it's too difficult, and the fact that it's a little bit difficult puts me off, and it's not something that you're gonna do every time you get on a ride. It just adds to the faff. It's not easy, so it makes me not want to do it. And actually, to be honest, it makes me not want to ride with a pillion, which was not the whole reason, but it was a big part of the decision for me getting this bike in the first place. So those are the reasons that it's not actually suitable for me. Now, before I go on to the problems I've had, and I promise you there are some serious issues with this bike. Before I go on to that though, I should say that all of the issues that I'm highlighting are really issues with this because it's my only bike. If this was a second bike, I would have no problem with it whatsoever. But because it's my only bike, oh, that sounds good. That's the full Zard exhaust, by the way. But because it's my only bike, I need it to do other things, and it just doesn't. So if it sounds like I'm being picky, or even raising things that are stupid because you know them in advance, those are the reasons. Now, problems then. So I have had a number of problems with this bike right from the word go, and I hate to say this about a British manufacturer. So I really hate to say this about a British manufacturer, but there have been some major problems, and it's not just me. I've been on Facebook groups and forums, and I've seen a number of other people with the same problem. Now I want to make sure I cover them all, so I've written a list, and I don't want to go over that list on the bike because I will forget some. So let's go back to the studio and I'll cover them all off for you there.
So the first 3 issues are fault, and the rest are niggling points that I personally think are not acceptable on a 12 grand bike. First up is the stock tyres losing pressure. Now I had the stock tyres for the first 4,000 miles and they constantly lost masses of pressure. The first time I noticed it, the front tyre was down to 12 psi against a recommended level of 36, and it would regularly lose 6 psi in the space of a few miles after topping up, and every month or so it'd drop all the way down to 10 or 15 psi, and once even got as low as 8 psi. I took it to the dealer twice, who tried changing the valves and resealing the tyres, but none of that worked, and when they asked Triumph UK, they were told to tell me that tyre pressures are part of your daily checks, which quite frankly is total and utter bollocks. And this is a known issue. I've heard from dozens of other Scrambler owners who've had the same problem. When I changed tyres to a set of Bridgestone Battleaxe A41s, the issue disappeared instantly. Whether that's a coincidence, I don't know, but shame on you, Triumph. I had to live with that for a year and you weren't prepared to help me, so I won't be rushing back anytime soon. Next up is the brushed aluminium parts spoiling. The handguards, fuel cap and some side parts are a lovely brushed aluminium, but they seem to go to ruin pretty quickly, and mine have ended up covered with black spots that I can't remove. Others have had the same problem and got it fixed under warranty, but my take on it was that it was probably likely to keep happening, so I didn't bother. Now that might just be something you have to live with as part of having brushed aluminium, but there must be a coating Triumph could put on to prevent the issue. And finally, my clutch cable went loose after about 9 months, which meant I had to pull it as tight as possible to change gear, and it would wobble when the clutch was closed. Something I could have got fixed easily, but a problem I don't expect to experience. And when I got the touring screen fitted, it wore away the clutch cable cover. Now fortunately I noticed it before the clutch cable snapped, so there was no real problem. I took it back to Triumph fixed it, and they told me they were considering a recall, although I haven't seen anything since. Now I expect better quality control on a premium bike, so for me that was all really disappointing, particularly the tyres, which is totally unacceptable. But I also have gripes about other things on the bike. The heat from the stock exhaust warms your inner thigh to an uncomfortable level, and you can fix that by installing a decap pipe, but if you don't, you will not want to get stuck in traffic, especially on a hot day. Second gear is also hard to find sometimes when pulling off. I regularly found myself hitting false neutrals no matter how much of a shove I gave the gear lever, and before I fitted the Zard exhaust, the fueling at idle was awful. I've never had a bike that's so easy to stall, which is annoying, and it makes you look like an absolute retard. And I don't think Triumph can use emissions regulations as an excuse for it running lean. Other manufacturers seem to manage okay, so I'm not letting them off that easily. The keyless system is also really clunky. I personally love keyless entry on my car, but Triumph haven't implemented it very well at all. For a start, you often get a key fob not in range message appear on the dash for no apparent reason. But more to the point, the only way to set the steering lock is to use the physical key. So if you have to get the key out whenever you pull up, what's the point of keyless? Honda has a neat system where you can set the steering lock by turning a knob without the key. Triumph take note. My physical key also wouldn't open without manual intervention, and now I'm sure Triumph would have replaced it, but spending every weekend at my local dealer isn't exactly what I bought the bike for. And my final gripe is the cruise control. It's a naff one button system whereby you press it once to put it on standby, then press it again to set the speed. Only you need to be travelling at a flat speed, otherwise it won't work. So if you're accelerating or decelerating slightly, it won't engage, and that means you spend a good few seconds focusing on turning the thing on rather than looking at the road ahead. And because there's no resume button, you have to repeat the process every time you slow down or speed up. And there's no plus or minus buttons, so if you set the speed at 39 miles per hour, you have to disengage, speed up by 1 mile per hour, then re-engage to get it to 40, which of course your OCD will force you to do because your brain will explode otherwise. Now, I've never sold a bike after a year, but I grew to resent this thing in the end, mainly because it wasn't quite right for me, but also because of the numerous quality issues. It's often said on YouTube that there are no bad bikes these days, but this bike sails dangerously close to the wind, and while I've enjoyed riding it for the most part, I can't honestly say I'd recommend it, and it's put me right off the thought of owning another Triumph. So what have I bought to replace it? Well, I've gone for a KTM 1290 Super Duke GT. Out of the frying pan into the fire, you might say. If you found the video useful then, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more biking goodness.